And then without further ado, I am pleased to present this online lecture number 2 of a series on access to finance and the role of financial creditworthiness for water utilities. As Chris said, I'll be co-presenting along with Eyal, and very excited about sharing with so many people. I was tracking as we were getting started, and I saw that we have probably over 100 people who have joined at this point. So either you're very interested in the topic or you have nothing better to do with your afternoon or morning. And I'm glad to imagine and hopeful to imagine that it's more that you're really legitimately interested in this topic. This is probably a topic that a lot of people say is important, a topic people like to talk about, but not a topic that everybody clearly understands. So my goal with the presentation I'll be giving and the one that I've coordinated with Eyal is to really demystify what we mean when we talk about access to finance and creditworthiness for water utilities. I recognize that many of you will be coming in as water sector specialists, whether you are working for a utility, for an aid agency, for a DFI, for anybody else who's relevant within the sector. But I also know that there's some people who are dialed in who are not water specialists and who instead come at this from a financial perspective. So I will try also to touch on what's unique about the water sector relative to other types of infrastructure. But if I were to say what my goal is with today's lecture, first and foremost, it's to demystify what some of these terms are and to really make this as accessible as possible, not to make this something which is too jargon heavy. But I also do recognize that it's important to introduce these terms either for those who are very familiar with them or for those who are seeking greater knowledge. So again, I always find that it's helpful to lay out an agenda at the start of any lecture, and I'm glad to start with sharing this. So the agenda effectively will run through introducing creditworthiness, the importance of financial creditworthiness for water utilities, assessing financial creditworthiness, financial instruments and their dependence on creditworthiness, common creditworthiness mistakes and challenges and how to overcome them, and then fundamental steps to improve creditworthiness, including who is involved and the expected time commitment required. But I think it all really boils down to understanding why creditworthiness is important and how creditworthiness can help you as a utility, or how it can help you as anybody who's supporting a utility to be able to really understand where some of the challenges are for utilities and how effectively to be able to address all of those different questions and concerns. So again, one of the things I thought was important is just to start with what some of the basic terms are when we talk about financing and talk about creditworthiness. So one of the things that I think people use and maybe don't understand is what the term capital markets actually means. So I wanted to just run through capital markets, commercial finance, and concessionary finance as a basic glossary. Although there are many other terms that could go in, these are probably 3 of the most important. So the first one, capital markets, is really understanding what the instruments are. And so when we talk capital markets, we're really talking about financial markets in which long-term debt, meaning debt that's over a year, or equity-backed securities are bought and sold. When we talk about capital markets, for the most part within the water sector, we are talking about these long-term loans that are either put into the market in some way that's meaningful or where they're directly introduced as bonds. And so we will talk later on in this lecture about bonds and why bonds themselves are important and how bonds do or do not factor into the overall picture of where different water utilities might be. The other 2 things that we want to talk through are commercial finance relative to concessionary finance. So when we talk commercial finance, we're really referencing loans that are extended at market rates and are probably over a shorter period of time or tenor, which is the other way to describe the period of time, than concessionary finance. So concessionary finance refers to loans that are extended on terms that are substantially more generous than market loans and where the concessionality is achieved either through lower interest rates than market rates or by grace periods, or by just thinking of things over a much longer period of time than what we would typically see in the rest of the market. Again, we will come back to these terms over the course of the lecture, but I wanted to just throw these out as 3 important terms to keep in mind. One of the things that I always do when I lecture, though, is I recognize that a lot of this material can be awfully dry. And so what I am going to try to do is to pepper this with anecdotes as well as with examples that might be far more accessible for those who are listening and those particularly who don't have that much knowledge as far as creditworthiness and how that applies to the water sector. So I like to throw in comics and cartoons every once in a while. And in this section, introducing creditworthiness, I start with this cartoon. Basically, the implication here is that we recognize that credit reports are potentially not going to be particularly favorable, and that we need to also acknowledge and own up to the fact that sometimes our credit scores are not where they want to be or where we would like them to be. And so I wanted to start with credit scores and understanding what makes up your credit score. This picture is not one that you as a utility might be thinking about. And the reason why I'm using this as an example is because I don't think that we should be jumping straight into trying to imagine credit scores for utilities. I think that we can, though, think about credit scores and credit ratings as interchangeable terms. And when we talk about credit scores, let's think about credit scores and where that's relevant or useful. When we talk about credit scores for individuals, we're talking about credit scores where they're analyzed for typically one of two purposes. The first one is if you go to your bank and you say, I would like to have a credit card. And why do you want a credit card? You want a credit card for longer term purchases or purchases that you would like to pay off over a longer period of time than what maybe your current or checking account can support. And so you open up a credit card, so you have an account, and that account allows you to purchase things over a longer period of time. But in order for a bank or a financial institution to understand whether or not they want to issue that credit card to you, they need to have a sense of what your credit score is. And so they'll look to see what your payment history is like. So are you employed? What does your payment history indicate as far as the regularity of payment, the amount of money you receive payment on, whether you've been receiving payments for a long period of time, or whether you're recently hired for a particular position, what the credit mix might look like, what your debt looks like over a period of time, typically over the last 12 to 18 months, what your capacity looks like as far as whether you have other credit cards that are outstanding and open. And then also, if there is a sense of it, what the period of time would be that you can understand your credit to be in place, whether you're relatively new to the credit market and whether you don't have a credit card and have never had a credit card relative to somebody who might have multiple credit cards, all of which are caught up. So credit cards are one instance where we talk about credit scores. Another instance where we talk about it is within the idea of applying for a mortgage. I know that mortgages are far more prevalent in the US and in Europe than they are in most parts of Africa and Asia. But nonetheless, if you are taking on a mortgage, meaning you are borrowing money in order to purchase a home, the bank that is lending you the money for that purchase needs to analyze what your credit looks like. And so they will also rely on your credit score as a way to determine whether or not you are, in fact, a good credit risk. So what does that have to do with credit scores and credit ratings for utilities? As a matter of fact, I would argue that it has everything to do with it. When we talk about the credit ratings for a utility, that credit rating is critical in determining what the actual, let's say, rate should be that a financial institution is lending money at. If you are an investor trying to determine what you feel comfortable putting in as an equity investment, particularly looking at what the performance of the utility has been. So while it might seem like there in fact is a big difference between credit scores and the credit ratings for a utility, there's actually not much of a difference at all. And that's why I wanted to open with this, because it's always important from my perspective to imagine ways in which credit scores, or this topic which directly impacts you as an individual, can also be applied to something like what we're talking about today. So again, I've talked about credit scores, but it's important to also understand what creditworthiness is. So just to run through the definitions that people often use, creditworthiness is a measure of the ability to meet debt obligations. It considers financial management, including current debt obligations and historical debt servicing, own source revenues, the ability to generate positive cash flow, governance and operational performance, regulations, and their impact on growth and profitability. But when we talk about creditworthiness, we need to understand creditworthiness within a broader spectrum. So we can't talk about creditworthiness specifically as being, well, you are creditworthy and you are not. Instead, the major credit ratings agencies talk about credit ratings within various scores or ratings. And so we will talk through on the next slide what those credit ratings actually look like and try to understand how this actually comes through and whether this in fact is relevant. But I think that one of the high level things that I hope that everybody will take away from today's lecture is that high creditworthiness increases the ability and lowers the cost to water utilities of accessing external financing. And I think that there's an important thing for us to pay attention to, and that's the concept that we're talking about external financing rather than just financing in general. And why I think it's important to talk about external financing is because as water utilities, there are different ways that you can think about how you fund your projects. Some of the funding comes from own source revenues and just the ability to take that money and apply it in a different way within your company. Unfortunately, water utilities often lack the overall resources required to deliver not just on smaller projects, but on the larger projects that in fact are the driver for the type of growth in reaching some of the most vulnerable communities, the type of growth required for covering your service area, the type of growth required to reach things like the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 6. So I think that all of this comes back to that question of creditworthiness as being critically important in order to help financial institutions to make important distinctions and also use available data to make the appropriate decisions about where and how they want to invest their money. So as far as talking about credit ratings, the next slide talks about how creditworthiness is measured. And on my screen, I'm actually blocking, and I'll move this so that it hopefully is not blocking for you as well, how creditworthiness is measured. I'll let Eyal talk about where GCR, Global Credit Ratings, fits in, but the two entities that we normally talk about as far as doing credit ratings are Moody's and S&P's, or Standard & Poor's. They use relatively similar ways of looking at the question of creditworthiness. The only difference is the way that they use their letters, and there are differences in their methodologies, which we won't have the chance to go through today. But I think the most important thing for us to look at here is the question of investment grade versus speculative grade utilities or companies in more general terms. So when we talk about investment grade, those are the ones that are rated from an S&P perspective as being BBB and above. So AAA, AA, single A, and BBB are all the investment grade utilities or investment grade companies. Why does that matter? Because when we talk about, again, where either financial institutions that are making loans, financial institutions that are making equity investments, or even those that are looking at making grant commitments to you as utilities, will look hypothetically, if you do have a credit rating, to get a sense of what all of the credit rating signals indicate as far as where you might fall. And I would say that unfortunately, or potentially fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, most water utilities in the global south would be speculative rather than investment grade. We can talk a little bit more later on about why speculative grade might actually be a good opportunity to demonstrate what you've grown from and where you might be able to grow to, but also talk about speculative grade as far as a realization about some of the challenges that the water sector in particular faces. So we will come back to that, and I'll rely on Eyal to talk more about what GCR's approach is and how GCR thinks about creditworthiness and its measurements as well. So we can talk about creditworthiness, but let's talk about why creditworthiness actually matters. As a headline, again, credit ratings boost water utilities' financing prospects and help in decision-making, both for the utility, but also for those sources of finance that would be looking to come in. And we can talk about it within really 4 different buckets. The first bucket being access to capital markets. So thinking back to the glossary and the terms that I went through, capital markets is one of them. Access to capital markets is, I would say, critical for any water utility that has visions of growth and visions of being able to access money that's over a period of time where the assets that you're investing in match against the financing which is available. And so we will talk about this not just today, but in other lectures, this question of the fact that we often see a mismatch between the length of time of the financing, or the tenor, as I described earlier, and the asset's useful life itself. So one of the things that we can see through having access to capital markets is that, in fact, there is access to the type of money which is long-term. And receiving that formal credit rating allows water utilities often to get listed on capital markets, or at the very least to find instruments that allow them to access the funds that are required. So one of the examples that we'll run through later, both in terms of ratings, but also in terms of architecture, is the Kenya Pooled Water Fund, which through bond issuances has been able, at least hypothetically, to attract new investors to the water sector through its architecture. And we can talk a little bit about what some of the challenges are with the Kenya Pooled Water Fund, But I think in essence, we can talk about KPWF as being one of the instruments that really relies on credit ratings as a signal to investors that, in fact, this is a worthwhile investment and does allow for them to put their money in on a long-term basis, but for utilities to get long-term money and access to that long-term money. The other thing, so looking down this list, the second is that credit ratings are basically a trusted source of company information. Again, a credit rating agency is going to be an independent agency. And so they will conduct their credit review, which is part of the credit rating process, to see an independent viewpoint on what the water utility looks like. And this is, I would say, probably the most important element in my mind of why you get a credit rating. And that's because as a utility seeking financing, you can put your information out to the market and you can claim to be a strong utility and you can claim to be investment grade, but your claim itself might end up being something which ends up being potentially less worthwhile than coming from an independent credit rating agency. I see that there are some questions coming through. I see that Stephen raised his hand. I'm not sure how we best want to go through this. What I can say is that we probably will take a break after I finish the next few slides. So if you can mark down your questions, because I don't see the chat box, unfortunately, that would be a great time for us to talk through some of the things that come up. One thing that I forgot to mention, the way that we're intending to structure this lecture is I'll do this, let's say, opening third, Eyal will do the middle, and then I'll come back in for the final third. So we will take a break at 1/3 and 2/3 of the way through to go through any questions that come up. So Stephen, if you can jot down your question, and anybody else who has questions, it would be great to be able to come back to those as we go through this. The next point, though, within this is talking about cost of capital. So we can talk about capital markets, but we can also talk about cost of capital. When we talk about cost of capital, that's really what are you as a utility paying for the financing that you're getting. And research has shown that higher credit ratings attract more favorable rates, and more favorable rates really normally materialize through either lower interest rates and or longer terms, which again is a cycle back to the fact that this is a factor of investor confidence in the companies seeking finance themselves. The final thing on this slide is streamlined operations. And this really comes down to the fact that regular, I would say, check-ins on your water utility functions, on your daily operations, will actually help you to improve your accountability and your efficiency. So I know that there are some entities out there that are trying to help water utilities to better track what their non-revenue water rates are like. So for those of you who are not water sector people, non-revenue water covers a number of different areas where the utility is not monetizing the water that it's producing for sale, whether that be due to physical loss, whether that be due to theft from the system, whether that be due to institutional payers or users that refuse to pay. All of those do impact the way that a water utility is functioning, and having these regular credit ratings allows you as a water utility to be able to basically have these check-ins. So it's almost like having an external audit rather than the internal audits that are normally conducted by you as the CFOs or other people within the finance departments of water utilities. But moving along to the next slide, because I am conscious of time and I want to make sure that we have sufficient time to talk through everything. I do want to also talk about how creditworthiness and access to finance intersect. So if you look at the diagram on the left-hand side, you'll see that there are 3 different areas of the pyramid. The bottom one is the operational or annual program side. And annual budgets really look at what your costs are for operating as a water utility over the course of a given 12-month period. This is critically important because if you don't have the money to pay salaries, you don't have the money to turn on your lights, you really can't think about doing anything for your customers, the people who are using water at the household or the commercial or industrial level. So you do need to always keep your operational side in mind. But the operational side is probably not where you would be thinking about going out to the capital markets to raise money. As a matter of fact, many utilities, and for those of you that are municipalities who have the responsibility of providing water service, you will probably be restricted. Again, for those municipalities that are in the public sector, you can't go out and borrow for operational needs in the capital markets. So almost imagine knocking that bottom blue portion of the pyramid out, because that doesn't really, I would say, reflect where we're talking about access to finance. Instead, it's really the top two. So the tactical or 3-year capital program budget. And that's a multi-year capital plan, which talks about longer term investments and really imagines what the deployment or use of capital would end up looking like for financing. And that's the type of projects that you might view as construction projects, where you would want to see longer term finance coming through once the construction is complete. Again, we'll talk about that in greater detail later on. But I would argue that the most important part of this pyramid is that strategic or 10-year plan, where you as a water utility will set out your long-term vision and policies, and then figure out how you can actually do your planning against that. And when I say planning, we talk about planning often from a technical and engineering standpoint, but if there's a disconnect, particularly within the utility on the engineering side and the financing side, we might end up in a place where we have beautifully designed plans from an engineering perspective, but actually no prospect of getting them financed. Again, I would argue that core and central to the idea of getting your engineering and technical plans financed is having access to the finance that ends up being required, and also the finance that relies on credit ratings in order to come through. So again, I know that I'm probably repeating myself, but I can't stress the importance of trying to figure out ways to get the finance you need. And often one of the best ways to get that finance is by signaling to the market that you in fact are ready. And one of the best signals is a credit rating. So this next slide is one that I particularly enjoy because I think that while it looks confusing at the beginning, it's actually fairly straightforward to review. Looking at this slide, and this is adapted from part of the World Bank Group from their global water practice, this slide looks at what it means to be creditworthy, and then once you are creditworthy, what does that look like as far as your I would say available diversity of funding sources. So if we look from bottom to top, we can start with looking at unviable providers. Those are providers that face significant challenges in the availability of revenue coming in from their customers. Again, whether those customers are residential, commercial, or industrial. And so those unviable providers are ones that are going to be significantly dependent on capital and operational subsidies in order to be functional. And those are ones where, when we think about it from a non-revenue water perspective, they might have 80, 90% non-revenue water, which means that they're collecting only 10% of what they should be based on the amount of water that flows from them to the users, again, regardless of what the user type might be. So those are going to be entities that are almost exclusively reliant on grants. They won't have the ability to access money from any of the other sources of finance because of the fact that they are not demonstrating creditworthiness. So moving up that chain, we go to pay-as-you-go or recovery of cash outlays. They also will probably need capital subsidies, but are unlikely to be as dependent on them, and might be able, if you imagine looking on the horizontal straight across from the top of pay-as-you-go, you can almost begin to hit concessional finance. And so concessional finance, again, going back to the glossary, is referencing that finance which is below market, potentially longer term, and able to be responsive to the needs of a utility which is, I would say, struggling but on its way to be successful and be creditworthy. Moving up, we then get to ones where there's operating cost recovery, and we can see that at any point in time or any given year, we might see that there's profitability, but not financial sustainability. And those, I would say, the bulk of the utilities, at least those that I've worked with across Africa and Asia, would fit into that operating cost recovery category, where they're still grant reliant, but not exclusively grant reliant, and can start to look at concessional finance as a mechanism for being able to bring in additional money for particularly those longer term projects. Continuing to move up, we get to financial sustainability for utilities, and that's where revenue plus other reliable resources cover the full cost of service provision and sustainability. Thomas, I see you've come off of mute. Is there something you'd like to say? Okay, I guess not. So financial sustainability, we'll see that that's a mix of commercial finance and concessional finance. And then at the very top, we'll see fully creditworthy utilities. Those are the utilities that will get something in the investment grade category and will be able to access commercial finance plus concessional finance as and where needed, and then grants as well. There are definitely examples across Africa and Asia of fully creditworthy utilities. And in fact, I'll look for Eyal to talk through some of those that he has rated as part of his work with GCR, one of which he did as part of a WashFin assignment, where he was able to look and help to demonstrate that one of the strongest utilities across Africa is in fact performing at what we would call a fully creditworthy level, and was able on the back of that to demonstrate and attract commercial finance to come in to provide what was required in order for that utility's growth. But I wanted to talk to those utilities who are saying, this sounds really great. I would love to get a credit rating done, but I'm actually credit shy. I don't know whether or not I want to go out there and have somebody come through and look at my dirty laundry and question whether or not I'm performing well and question all these other things. So I wanted to at least allay some of your concerns and fears by talking about the idea of shadow ratings. So shadow ratings end up being a way that as a utility, you can get a credit agency to come in and conduct a rating without this being something that needs to go public. So it's an unofficial rating, oftentimes, but not always. It will be something that's priced at a cheaper rate than what a full public credit rating would be. And it can be something which is helpful to a company that's contemplating issuing debt in the market, but not sure whether they're actually going to get a strong rating. So this ends up being a mechanism or tool that you can use to determine how your performance looks, what that performance ends up entailing, and whether or not you think that you would be ultimately successful or not. I am actually now able to look to see some of these questions coming in, and these look like great questions. So I'm looking forward to going through them once we get to the next part of where we are. But again, thinking about credit shy utilities, the reason why I would recommend that utility consider getting shadow ratings is it allows you to work with a credit rating agency, have them come in, assess your performance, and then work on those issues so that you can resolve them as and where needed, rather than let the market know where your performance is. So just to use a particular example, I've done a lot of work in the capital city of Senegal, in Dakar. And in my work in Dakar, I said, before we go out and procure a public credit rating, let's do a shadow credit rating. So we engaged Moody's to do a shadow credit rating so that we could determine what the city's baseline performance looks like. We could determine how the city is performing relative to its peers, and then, most important, identify the areas where there were challenges so we could address them when we went forward with a public credit rating. And unsurprisingly, the largest area where we found that we needed to do some work was within financial management. So we used that as an opportunity to say, specifically within financial management, what are the areas we need to work on? And the largest area was working on revenue collection and trying to figure out the billing and collection efficiency of the city. If you transpose city to utility, I would be surprised if the majority of those who are on the call as participants representing utilities would say anything other than the fact that one of their largest financial management concerns and considerations is revenue and dealing with issues associated, for example, with non-revenue water. Again, like I said, I like to throw cartoons in. You can laugh at these at your leisure, but the thing that I wanted to talk about in this section, and we will go through this and then stop after a couple of slides to take some of your questions, is the importance of financial creditworthiness for water utilities. So as I said, I looked through the list of people who RSVP'd to participate in today's session, and I see that a number of you are people who I recognize as being within the water sector, but I also see that some of you are not water sector people and who are more curious from a financial point of view. So I wanted to do at least one slide that references the uniqueness of the water sector. When we talk about the water sector, I would say that while people liken the water sector today to where the power sector was 15 years ago, there are things that make the water sector particularly unique. And I would argue that it's because of the fact that there still seems to be a disconnect between the concept of water as a commodity relative to water as a basic human right. And from a financial point of view, a lot of people will look and say, well, we need to look at this as a commodity that's available for sale. What does it look like? How do we end up addressing that? But at the same time, water ends up being political, and people will say water is a right, not a commodity. And further, SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation specifically references the fact that we should have access to clean water and sanitation for all. And that ends up being a challenge for many of the utilities who are saying they want to be able to demonstrate creditworthiness, and they recognize that non-revenue water rates do impact the vision of creditworthiness. But at the same time, if there is going to be access for all, there needs to either be significant subsidies in order to carry down the cost to a place that in fact is manageable for some of the world's most vulnerable populations, or there needs to be some other mitigation against that. And there is a tremendous disconnect then between water as a commodity and water as a basic human right, which I think comes down to the crux of where a lot of these problems come through. What I did want to close with on this section before taking some questions is a report, though, that was done 12 years ago, commissioned by the World Bank and conducted as a series of ratings by Global Credit Ratings, looking across Africa at 7 different utilities to do a comparative utility creditworthiness assessment. And if you think back to where things showed up as far as being in that credit rating chart, and remember where investment grade versus speculative grade comes through, with the exception of SDE in Senegal, all of the others were rated and their ratings came through as being investment, not speculative grade. I wanted to include this, number one, to show that, as a matter of fact, these conversations have been around for a while, even though finance is increasingly coming to the fore in conversations about water, but also to show that these utilities, whether they be water service boards in Kenya, which now are the water service providers, whether they be national corporations that are responsible for providing across the country, as in the case of NWSC in Uganda, whether they're some of the French examples that show up, in all of these, they do come through as being investment grade. And that means that there is, in fact, access to money. One of these, NWSC, is one that Eyal and GCR did a credit rating of about 18 months ago, so he'll be able to talk in greater detail about that. But like I said, before I turn it over for him to give a much deeper insight and look at what it means to conduct credit ratings and what goes into conducting and completing those credit ratings, I do want to take a pause here to do some Q&A. One of the things that we probably need to figure out is whether I go through and answer the questions that have come through in the chat box, or whether we do chat box plus live questions. What I would prefer to do is probably take the top 3 that have come in Q&A and then take one from the floor. Chris, I see you've taken yourself off of mute. Does that sound like a good suggestion, or is there a different way that you think this would be most effective?
No, I think that's a good approach. Just on the Q&A box, there are 2 questions that ended up getting pushed over into the answered column. So if you click on the tab at the top there and just check the bottom 2 comments there, they were the first 2 questions to come in. And then you click back to the open ones.
Yeah, and I see that some of the answered ones are about whether this is being recorded or whether we'll share the lecture notes. Absolutely, we will share this presentation, and we will also make a recording available. So let me just go through. I see that there are now 10 questions that have come in just randomly. I see one: how would this be useful to grant-funded organizations and not-for-profits? I would argue that grant-funded organizations, whether they be utilities or otherwise, could find this to be particularly useful when trying to speak to the grant-making bodies. I think that one of the challenges, particularly in the COVID-19 era, is that a lot of people say, well, we're concerned about what our financials are going to show as far as our performance. I've read that there's been an anticipated drop that's now been realized of up to 50 to 60% of revenue in for many of the utilities across Africa and Asia. And I could understand that I would be concerned if I were a CFO, do I want to get a credit rating done right now? Remember, and again, Eyal will explain this in greater detail, but your financial performance is only a portion of what your overall credit rating looks like. There's a significant amount of consideration of internal management, of corporate governance, of what your plans look like. So I would say that your demonstration of your resilience during an epidemic like this actually might play to your favor rather than be something negative. So I would think that that's something that we can go through in trying to imagine this. We can look at that when Eyal presents, and I'll come back through this. Next question I see is, can a utility's credit rating differ significantly from a country credit rating, considering that most utilities are either directly or indirectly linked to national government? So I would first say that it would be important to make the distinction between, and looking at the screen itself, the fact that there are some water service providers that are part of county government, particularly in Kenya, relative to the national utilities or the national entities like those in Uganda and arguably those that are found in West Africa and in North Africa. But I would say that regardless, there would be a difference between what the credit rating would look like from a utility and then what the national credit rating would be. The national credit rating is going to set the sovereign ceiling. And I would argue that we would not ever see an instance where a utility would be able to pierce that sovereign ceiling, meaning that it would be able to get a credit rating higher than what national government would get. But I would say that there could be a significant discrepancy between what the national credit rating is and what a utility credit rating is, particularly if a utility is a poor performer or if it does have a significant amount of internal challenges. So I would say that yes, there would be a difference and potentially a large discrepancy, despite the fact that utilities are either directly or indirectly linked to national government. And that's, again, a function of the fact that while national government will typically provide some sort of subsidy, that's not going to represent the exclusive sort of finances coming in. In fact, I would say that the revenue coming in from users ends up being far more of a consideration. But again, I'll leave that to Eyal. I'll do one more question from this. So I see a question, can you discuss the depth of capital markets as a constraint? Do Senegal and Tunisia have enough availability, as an example? I would say that's actually a terrific question. I would love to do an entirely separate lecture on the topic, but I'll take 30 seconds to answer it nonetheless. The depth of the capital markets is actually far more profound than what a lot of people give it credit for. And that's because we can talk about capital markets not only in the form of lending that's available from commercial banks, from development finance institutions, and from other participants from that side who are offering loans, but there's also a significant amount, and actually this is more of where I would even say capital markets exist, of money which is tied up in institutional investors that are prepared, as a matter of fact, to invest through bond issuance into utilities. And so that can take the form of these pooled mechanisms, and so I'll run through the Kenya Pooled Water Fund as an example, but also can take the form of discrete bond issuances by individual utilities that are looking to come to market. I would say that that's something that is increasingly coming to the fore, and in particular, when people talk about domestic resource mobilization, I would say that that's critical to that conversation. I promise, though, I will take one question from the floor. So is there anybody who quickly will raise their hand, who Thomas can help me to unmute, who would like to pose a question before I turn over for Eyal?
Sorry, Jeremy, we have a question from Harriet. I'm going to unmute Harriet right now if I can. Harriet, please go ahead. Sorry, I'm not getting the question from the audience. I'm not hearing it. Sorry about that. Harriet, if you'll type your message in the Q&A, we can take it there. I suggest work your way through the Q&A questions.
Do we have success stories of PPP modalities and creditworthiness in Africa? I would argue that we have success stories in PPPs in the water sector. I don't know how successful they've been, and if anybody else wants to weigh in on this, please feel free. But I think that largely those PPPs have either created special purpose vehicles, and those special purpose vehicles have, in certain instances, been able to access funds from the development finance institutions. In other cases, we would be able to look at PPPs or public-private partnerships where the private sector is able to go out and raise money on its own. But I don't know whether there would be specific examples where we can talk about creditworthiness for this as an example. I do know though, and so I've done some work in Zambia helping Lusaka Water, trying to look at how it might be able to access money for a project that's being considered under the Lusaka Water Security Initiative, under LUCI, where there are conversations about creating a special purpose vehicle in Lusaka West, where it would be a public-private partnership effectively between Lusaka Water and that special purpose vehicle, where Coca-Cola and other private sector entities would come in. And I would argue in that instance, creating that special purpose vehicle, which would be its own financial instrument that would be able to raise money in the market, given the size of that transaction, it might make sense for that to be something that would be issued as a bond in the local market in Zambia. And because of the fact that institutional investors are in fact interested in investing into the water sector, because of the fact that we'd be talking a very long-term instrument, there would be pension funds and insurance companies that would have strong appetite. One thing that I haven't mentioned thus far is that a lot of those pension funds and insurance companies need to see an investment grade rating from either the instrument or the issuer. And so if we were to imagine this, there would probably need to be some sort of credit enhancement that would enable the instrument to go from being, let's say, speculative grade to investment grade. And that sort of instrument would be really helpful, because we would see, for example, this coming in as a speculative grade beneath that BBB, and a credit enhancement, whether it come in from a DFI or an aid agency offering that, or whether it come in from a private sector entity that's prepared to issue a credit enhancement, would be something critical in order to enable that domestic resource mobilization from pension funds investing directly into utilities. But I know that that's probably a little more detailed than what some of you would like to be investigating. I will, at this point, be stopping with my part of the presentation so that Eyal can talk through the specifics of what it means to be doing a credit assessment, and then we'll come back into some of these conversational points and questions. Because I do see that there are going on 20 questions that are coming up, and there are 100 people who are in the room. One thing that we can always do as a follow-on is I will take all of these questions, review them with my colleagues, and we will post the answers to those questions, because I don't know if we will have a chance to answer every single one of them. And I also think that there will probably be some links to either papers that would be helpful to additionally review this with, and or entities that are providing the support by doing credit ratings, potentially those aid agencies that would want to cover the cost of credit ratings, or those entities that are interested in looking at you once you do have a credit rating as investors or lenders. So I can see that there are a lot of things that will come from today's lecture, and I'm glad to see that there's so much interest. I will again stop here, turn it over for Eyal. Eyal, I'm going to give you remote control of the presentation. and I will mute myself so that you can run through all of this. But again, thrilled to see so much interest and looking forward to picking this up after Eyal finishes with his section of the presentation. So Eyal, over to you.